Story of Wali Dâd the Simple-Hearted by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time, there lived a poor old man whose name was Wali Dâd Gunjay or Wali Dâd the Bald. He had no relations, but lived all by himself in a little mud hut some distance from any town, and made his living by cutting grass in the jungle, and selling it as fodder for horses. He only earned by this 5 halfpence a day, but he was a simple old man, and needed so little out of it that he saved up 1 halfpenny daily, and spent the rest upon such food and clothing as he required. In this way he lived for many years, until one night he thought that he would count the money he had hidden away in the great earthen pot under the floor of his hut. So he set to work, and with much trouble he pulled the bag out onto the floor, and sat gazing in astonishment at the heap of coins which tumbled out of it. What should he do with them? All he wondered. But he never thought of spending the money on himself, because he was content to pass the rest of his days, as he had been doing for ever so long, and he really had no desire for any greater comfort or luxury. At last he threw all the money into an old sack which he pushed under his bed, and then rolled in his ragged old blanket. He went off to sleep. Early next morning, he staggered off with his sack of money to the shop of a jeweler whom he knew in the town, and bargained with him for a beautiful little gold bracelet. With this carefully wrapped up in his cotton waistband, he went to the house of a rich friend, who was a traveling merchant, and used to wander about with his camels and merchandise through many countries. Wali Dâd was lucky enough to find him at home, so he sat down, and after a little talk, he asked the merchant who was the most virtuous and beautiful lady he had ever met. With the merchant replied that the Princess of Cadence was renowned everywhere, as well for the beauty of her person, as for the kindness and generosity of her disposition. Then said Wali Dâd, next time you go that way, give her this little bracelet, with the respectful compliments of one who admires virtue far more than he desires wealth. With that he pulled the bracelet from his waistband, and handed it to his friend. The merchant was naturally much astonished, but said nothing, and made no objection to carrying out his friend's plan. Time passed by, and at length the merchant arrived in the course of his travels at the capital of Cadence. As soon as he had opportunity, he presented himself at the palace, and sent in the bracelet neatly packed in a little perfumed box provided by himself, giving at the same time the message entrusted to him by Wali Dâd. The princess could not think who could have bestowed this present on her, but she bade her servant to tell the merchant that if he would return after he had finished his business in the city, she would give him her reply in a few days. Therefore the merchant came back, and received from the princess a return present in the shape of a camelode or rich silks, besides a present of money for himself. With these he set out on his journey. Some months later he got home again from his journeyings, and proceeded to take Wali Dâd the princess present. Great was the perplexity of the good man to find a camelode of silks tumbled at his door. What was he to do with these costly things? But presently, after much thought, he begged the merchant to consider whether he did not know of some young prince to whom such treasures might be useful. Of course, cried the merchant, greatly amused, from Delhi to Baghdad, and from Constantinople to Lucknow, I know them all, and there lives none worthier than the gallant and wealthy young prince of Nekabad. Very well, then take the silks to him with the blessing of an old man, said Wali Dâd, much relieved to be rid of them. So the next time that the merchant journeyed that way he carried the silks with him, and in due course arrived at Nekabad, and sought an audience of the prince. When he was shown into his presence, he produced the beautiful gift of silks that Wali Dâd had sent, and begged the young man to accept them as a humble tribute to his worth and greatness. The prince was much touched by the generosity of the giver, and ordered, as a return present, 12 of the finest breed of horses, for which his country was famous, to be delivered over to the merchant, to whom, also before he took his leave, he gave a munificent reward for his services. As before, the merchant at last arrived at home, and next day he set out for Wali Dâd's house with the 12 horses. When the old man saw them coming in the distance, he said to himself, here's luck, a troop of horses coming, they are sure to want quantities of grass, and I shall sell all I have without having to drag it to market. Thereupon he rushed off and cut grass as fast he could. When he got back with as much grass as he could possibly carry, he was greatly discomfited to find that the horses were all for himself. At first he could not think what to do with them, but after a little a brilliant idea struck him. He gave 2 to the merchant, and begged him to take the rest to the Princess of Cadence, who was clearly the fittest person to possess such beautiful animals. The merchant departed laughing, but true to his old friend's request. He took the horses with him on his next journey, and eventually presented them safely to the princess. This time the princess sent for the merchant and questioned him about the giver. Now, the merchant was usually a most honest man, but he did not quite like to describe Wali Dâd in his true light as an old man whose income was 5 halfpence a day, and who had hardly clothes to cover him. So he told her that his friend had heard stories of her beauty and goodness, and had longed to lay the best he had at her feet. The princess then took her father into her confidence, and begged him to advise her what courtesy she might return to one who persisted in making her such presents. Well, said the king, you cannot refuse them, so the best thing you can do is to send this unknown friend at once a present so magnificent that he is not likely to be able to send you anything better, and so will be ashamed to send anything at all. Then he ordered that in place of each of the 10 horses 2 mules laden with silver should be returned by her. Thus in a few hours, the merchant found himself in charge of a splendid caravan, and he had to hire a number of armed men to defend it on the road against the robbers. And he was glad indeed to find himself back again in Wali Dâd's hut. Well now, cried Wali Dâd, as he viewed all the wealth laid at his door, I can well repay that kind prince for his magnificent present of horses. But to be sure you have been put to great expenses still, if you will accept 6 mules and their loads, and will take the rest straight to Nekabad, I shall thank you heartily. The merchant felt handsomely repaid for his trouble, and wondered greatly how the matter would turn out, so he made no difficulty about it. And as soon as he could get things ready he set out for Nekabad with this new and princely gift. This time the prince too was embarrassed, and questioned the merchant closely. The merchant felt that his credit was at stake, and whilst inwardly determining that he would not carry the joke any further, could not help describing Wali Dâd in such glowing terms that the old man would never have known himself had he heard them. The prince, like the king of Khaistan, determined that he would send in return a gift that would be truly royal, and which would perhaps prevent the unknown giver sending him anything more. So he made up a caravan on 20 splendid horses, caparisoned in gold-embroidered cloths with fine Morocco saddles, and silver bridles, and stirrups, also 20 camels of the best breed which had the speed of racehorses, and could swing along at a trot all day, without getting tired, and lastly 20 elephants with magnificent silver howdahs, and coverings of silk embroidered with pearls. To take care of these animals, the merchant hired a little army of men, and the troop made a great show as they traveled along. When Wali Dâd from a distance saw the cloud of dust which the caravan made, and the glitter of its appointments, he said to himself, by Allah, here's a grand crowd coming. Elephants to grass will be selling well today. And with that he hurried off to the jungle, and cut grass as fast as he could. As soon as he got back he found the caravan had stopped at his door, and the merchant was waiting a little anxiously to tell him the news, and to congratulate him upon his riches. Riches, cried Wali Dâd, what has an old man like me with 1 foot in the grave to do with riches? That beautiful young princess now shed be the one to enjoy all these fine things. Do you take for yourself 2 horses, 2 camels, and 2 elephants with all their trappings, and present the rest to her. The merchant at first objected to these remarks, and pointed out to Wali Dâd that he was beginning to feel these embassies a little awkward. Of course, he was himself richly repaid so far as expenses went, but still, he did not like going so often, and he was getting nervous. At length, however, he consented to go once more, but he promised himself never to embark on another such enterprise. So after a few days' rest, the caravan started off once more for Khaistan. The moment the king of Khaistan saw the gorgeous train of men and beasts entering his palace courtyard, he was so amazed that he hurried down in person to inquire about it, and became dumb when he heard that these also were a present from the princely Wali Dâd, and were for the princess his daughter. He went hastily off to her apartments, and said to her, I tell you what it is, my dear, this man wants to marry you. That is the meaning of all these presents. There is nothing for it but that we go and pay him a visit in person. He must be a man of immense wealth, and as he is so devoted to you, perhaps you might do worse than marry him. The princess agreed with all that her father said, and orders were issued for vast numbers of elephants and camels, and gorgeous tents and flags and litters, for the ladies and horses, for the men to be prepared without delay, as the king and princess were going to pay a visit to the great and munificent Prince Wali Dâd. The merchant the king declared was to guide the party. The feelings of the poor merchant in this sore dilemma can hardly be imagined. Willingly would he have run away, but he was treated with so much hospitality as Wali Dâd's representative that he hardly got an instant's real peace, and never any opportunity of slipping away. In fact, after a few days, despair possessed him to such a degree that he made up his mind that all that happened was fate, and that escape was impossible. But he hoped devoutly some turn of fortune would reveal to him a way out of the difficulties, which he had with the best intentions drawn upon himself. On the 7th day, they all started amidst thunderous salutes from the ramparts of the city and much dust, and cheering and blaring of trumpets. Day after day, they moved on, and every day the poor merchant felt more ill and miserable. He wondered what kind of death the king would invent for him, and went through almost as much torture, as he lay awake nearly the whole of every night, thinking over the situation, as he would have suffered, if the king's executioners were already setting to work upon his neck. At last they were only one day's march from Wali Dâd's little mud home here. A great encampment was made, and the merchant was sent on to tell Wali Dâd that the king and princess of Khaistan had arrived and were seeking an interview. When the merchant arrived, he found the poor old man eating his evening meal of onions and dry bread, and when he told him of all that had happened, he had not the heart to proceed to load him with the reproaches which rose to his tongue. For Wali Dâd was overwhelmed with grief and shame for himself, for his friend, and for the name and honor of the princess, and he wept and plucked at his beard and groaned, most piteously, with tears. He begged the merchant to detain them for one day by any kind of excuse he could think of, and to come in the morning to discuss what they should do. As soon as the merchant was gone, Wali Dâd made up his mind that there was only one honorable way out of the shame and distress that he had created by his foolishness, and that was to kill himself. So, without stopping to ask anyone's advice, he went off in the middle of the night to a place where the river wound along at the base of steep rocky cliffs of great height, and determined to throw himself down and put an end to his life. When he got to the place, he drew back a few paces, took a little run, and at the very edge of that dreadful black gulf, he stopped short. He could not do it. From below, unseen in the blackness of the deep night shadows, the water roared and boiled round the jagged rocks. Could picture the place, as he knew it, only 10 times more pitiless and forbidding in the visionless darkness. The wind soughed through the gorge with fearsome sighs and rustlings and whisperings, and the bushes and grasses that grew in the ledges of the cliffs seemed to him like living creatures that danced and beckoned. Shadowy and indistinct, an owl laughed, hoo-hoo, almost in his face as he peered over the edge of the gulf, and the old man threw himself back in a perspiration of horror. He was afraid. He drew back shuddering, and covering his face in his hands, he wept aloud. Presently he was aware of a gentle radiance that shed itself before him. Surely morning was not already coming to hasten and reveal his disgrace. He took his hands from before his face, and saw before him 2 lovely beings whom his instinct told him were not mortal, but were Peris from paradise. "Why do you weep, old man?" said one in a voice as clear and musical as that of the bulbul. "I weep for shame," replied he. "What do you here?" questioned the other. "I came here to die," said Wali Dâd, and as they questioned him, he confessed all his story. Then the first stepped forward and laid a hand upon his shoulder, and Wali Dâd began to feel that something strange he did not know was happening to him. His old cotton rags of clothes were changed to beautiful linen, and embroidered cloth on his hard bare feet were warm soft shoes, and on his head, a great jeweled turban. Round his neck there lay a heavy golden chain, and the little old bent sickle which he cut grass with and which hung in his waistband had turned into a gorgeous cimeter, whose ivory hilt gleamed in the pale light like snow and moonlight. As he stood wondering like a man in a dream, the other Peri waved her hand and bade him turn and see, and lo, before him a noble gateway stood open, and up an avenue of giant place trees. The Peris led him dumb with amazement. At the end of the avenue, on the very spot where his hut had stood, a gorgeous palace appeared ablaze with myriads of lights. Its great porticos and verandas were occupied by hurrying servants, and guards paced to and fro, and saluted him respectfully as he drew near along mossy walks, and through sweeping grassy lawns, where fountains were playing, and flowers scented the air. Wali Dâd stood stunned and helpless. "Fear not," said one of the Peris, "go to your house, and learn that God rewards the simply hearted." With these words they both disappeared, and left him. He walked on, thinking still that he must be dreaming. Very soon he retired to rest in a splendid room far grander than anything he had ever dreamed of. When morning dawned, he woke, and found that the palace and himself and his servants were all real, and that he was not dreaming after all. If he was dumbfounded, the merchant who was ushered into his presence soon after sunrise was much more So he told Wali Dâd that he had not slept all night, and by the first streak of daylight had started to seek out his friend. And what a search! He had had a great stretch of wild jungle country, had in the night been changed into parks and gardens, and if it had not been for some of Wali Dâd's new servants who found him and brought him to the palace, he would have fled away under the impression that his trouble had sent him crazy, and that all he saw was only imagination. Then Wali Dâd told the merchant all that had happened by his advice. He sent an invitation to the king and princess of Khaistan to come and be his guests together, with all their retinue and servants, down to the very humblest in the camp. For 3 nights and days, a great feast was held in honor of the royal guests. Every evening, the king and his nobles were served on golden plates, and from golden cups, and the smaller people on silver plates, and from silver cups, and each evening each guest was requested to keep the places and cups that they had used as a remembrance of the occasion. Never had anything so splendid been seen besides the great dinners. There were sports and hunting and dances and amusements of all sorts. On the 4th day, the king of Khaistan took his host aside and asked him whether it was true, as he had suspected, that he wished to marry his daughter. But Wali Dâd, after thanking him very much for the compliment, said that he had never dreamed of so great an honor, and that he was far too old and ugly for so fair a lady. But he begged the king to stay with him until he could send for the Prince of Nekabad, who was a most excellent, brave, and honorable young man, and would surely be delighted to try to win the hand of the beautiful princess. To this the king agreed, and Wali Dâd sent the merchant to Nekabad with a number of attendants, and with such handsome presents that the prince came at once fell head over ears in love with the princess, and married her at Wali Dâd's palace amidst a fresh outburst of rejoicings. And now the king of Khaistan and the prince and princess of Nekabad each went back to their own country, and Wali Dâd lived to a good old age, befriending all who were in trouble and preserving in his prosperity the simply-hearted and generous nature that he had when he was only Wali Dâd Gunjay the grass cutter. Told the author by an Indian.